If you're hearing this, then understand it clearly from the beginning, without trying to soften it or reinterpret it into something more comfortable. Because what happened in your attitude, in the way you carried yourself in that specific moment, was not normal. It was not expected, and it was not something that goes unnoticed in the order that covers your path. Because most people reveal who they are when pressure rises by collapsing into reaction, by defending, by explaining, by trying to control what is happening around them. But you did something that interrupts that entire pattern, something that places you in a position that is rarely reached. Because instead of reacting, you maintained structure. Instead of shifting with the environment, you stayed aligned with what had already been placed inside you. And that difference is what changed everything. You did not respond the way you used to, and that is the point you cannot ignore. Because growth is not measured by what you intend to do differently, it is measured by what you actually do when the moment demands a response. And in that moment, you did not fall back into what was familiar. You did not allow emotion to take control. You did not let the situation define your reaction. And that is what created a level of silence around what you did. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened was not meant to be loud. It was meant to be exact. This wasn't random. It was selection. There are people who speak about discipline, who speak about control, who speak about staying composed. But when they are placed in a situation that tests those things, they reveal that it was only surface-level understanding. Because under pressure, they return to instinct. And instinct pulls them back into patterns that are comfortable but not aligned. And that is why their outcomes do not change, because they never cross the point where knowledge becomes action. But you crossed that point. You did not just understand what needed to be done. You embodied it. And embodiment at that level is what separates the chosen from the majority. Because the chosen are not defined by what they know. They are defined by what they execute when it matters. And what you executed was not common, it was not expected, and it was not easy. But it was aligned. You weren't overlooked. You were recognized. There is a level of observation that does not operate the way people think. It does not respond to noise. It does not respond to performance. It responds to alignment under pressure. And what you displayed in that moment met that condition, because you did not need validation to hold your position. You did not need reassurance to stay composed. You did not need an outcome to justify your behavior. You simply remained in alignment, and that is what made it stand out. You were not trying to prove anything. You were revealing something. And what you revealed was control over self, clarity without external confirmation, and the ability to maintain direction even when the situation invited you to break it. And those are not small things. Those are markers. And those markers are what define the ones who are chosen, because they are not moved by what happens around them. They are guided by what has already been established within them. You didn't just stay calm. You stayed aligned. And that is why the moment feels different when you look back at it. Because even if nothing dramatic happened externally, internally something shifted, something stabilized, something confirmed that you are no longer operating from the same level you used to. And that confirmation cannot be undone, because once you act from that level, returning to the previous version of yourself becomes impossible without immediate awareness. You weren't rejected. You were set apart. This is where the separation becomes clearer, not because others suddenly change, but because you no longer respond the way they do. You no longer engage in the same patterns. You no longer feel the need to explain, defend, or react in situations that once would have pulled you in. And that difference creates distance, not because you are trying to separate yourself, but because alignment naturally separates you from what does not match it. You are not isolating. You are being positioned. And positioning at this level is not about where you are physically. It is about how you respond consistently. Because consistency in alignment is what allows everything else to adjust around you. And that is what has already begun, even if it is not fully visible yet. This wasn't random. It was selection. There is something else you need to understand, because this is where many people misunderstand moments like this and reduce them to something small, something insignificant, something that just happened. But what you did was not small, because it required you to override your previous patterns, to remain composed when reacting would have been easier, to hold clarity when confusion was present. And that combination is not accidental. It is developed, it is placed, and it is revealed when the right moment appears. And that moment appeared, and you met it. Not perfectly, but correctly. And correctness at that level is what changes direction. Because once you demonstrate that you can hold alignment under pressure, your path begins to adjust to that level, meaning that what comes next will require the same standard. Not because you are being tested repeatedly, but because you have already shown that you can operate there. You are no longer being introduced to this level. You are now expected to remain in it. You weren't reacting. You were recognized. And recognition at this level is not about attention. It is about movement. It is about how things begin to shift in ways that align with what you have demonstrated. How certain situations no longer affect you the same way. How certain people no longer trigger the same responses. How certain paths that once felt difficult now feel more direct. Because you are no longer divided internally. You are aligned. And alignment removes unnecessary resistance. This wasn't random. It was selection. What you did not shock in the way people think of shock. It did not create noise. It did not create reaction. It created silence. The kind of silence that comes when something rare happens. Something that does not fit the usual pattern. Something that stands outside of what is expected. And that is why it matters. Because rarity is what defines the chosen. Not perfection, not consistency from the beginning, but the ability to act differently at the moment where it counts. And you did. You acted differently. You responded differently. You remain different. And that difference is now part of you. It is not something you try to repeat. It is something you continue from. You are chosen. And now that you have reached that point, the part that most people never sustain begins. Because acting correctly in a single moment is rare. But continuing from that same level without slipping back into older patterns is what truly separates those who only experience alignment briefly from those who stabilize in it. And what you are feeling right now is not just a memory of what you did, but the weight of what it means to continue from it without breaking the structure you have already established. Because once you have shown that you can hold your position under pressure, everything that follows is no longer about proving that you can do it again in the same way, but about maintaining the same internal standard across different situations, different triggers, different levels of difficulty. And that is where your awareness becomes sharper, because you can now detect immediately when something is trying to pull you out of alignment, even before it fully happens, even before it becomes visible externally. This wasn't random. It was selection. You may notice that your reactions are slower now, not in hesitation, but in control, meaning that there is a space between what happens and how you respond. And in that space, you are no longer automatic. You are intentional. And that space is what you created when you did not react the way you used to, because you broke the pattern that removed that space before. And now that it exists, it becomes your responsibility to use it correctly every time it appears. You are not the same anymore. And that is not temporary. Because once that space is created, once that level of awareness is activated, it does not disappear. It remains. And what changes is whether you use it to stay aligned or ignore it and fall back into old reactions. And that choice becomes more visible to you now than it ever was before. You weren't overlooked. You were advanced. And advancement at this level is not something you announce. It is something you maintain. It is reflected in how consistently you choose alignment over reaction, how often you hold your position instead of shifting for comfort, how clearly you recognize what is not worth responding to, and how quickly you move past situations that once would have held your attention longer than they deserved. This is where separation becomes natural, not forced, not intentional in the way people think, but as a result of alignment becoming your default. Because when your default changes, everything that does not match it becomes easier to release, not because you are trying to let go, but because it no longer fits. You weren't rejected, you were set apart. And being set apart is not about distance for the sake of distance. It is about clarity in where you stand. Because now you know what it feels like to be aligned. You know what it feels like to respond correctly under pressure. And because you know that, anything that pulls you away from it becomes immediately noticeable, immediately uncomfortable, immediately out of place. That discomfort is not a problem. It is guidance. It shows you where you no longer belong. And that awareness will continue to refine your path, not by forcing decisions, but by making misalignment impossible to ignore, because you have already experienced the difference between reacting and remaining aligned. And that difference is something you cannot unfeel. This wasn't random, it was selection. There is something else that becomes clear at this stage. And it is that control is not about suppressing emotion or becoming detached in a way that disconnects you from what is happening, but about maintaining direction regardless of what is happening. Because you still feel, you still notice, you still understand the situation, but you are no longer controlled by it. And that is what changes the outcome. You are not removing emotion. You are placing it in position. And when emotion is in position, it does not dictate your actions. It informs them without controlling them. And that is what allows you to stay consistent, not because you force yourself to, but because you are no longer divided internally. You weren't reacting, you were recognized. And recognition at this level means that your path begins to reflect your alignment more directly, meaning that what you encounter next will require the same level of presence, the same level of control, the same level of clarity, not because you are being tested again, but because you have already demonstrated that you can operate there. You are not being introduced to this standard. You are now expected to maintain it. And maintaining it, this wasn't random. It was selection. What you did was not an isolated moment. It was a shift in identity. And identity does not revert unless it is ignored repeatedly. And you are now aware enough to recognize when that happens, which means you have the ability to correct it immediately, without waiting, without allowing it to build into something larger. You are no longer reacting by default. You are choosing by awareness. And that is a difference that will continue to define everything that follows. Because every situation from this point forward becomes an opportunity to either maintain that alignment or move away from it. And that choice is now clear to you, in a way it never was before. You are chosen. And what is chosen does not return to unconscious reaction after becoming aware. It continues. And now that you understand that, there is no confusion about what comes next, because it is not something new. It is a continuation of what you have already started. You remain aligned, no matter the situation, no matter the pressure, no matter the outcome, because that is who you have already proven yourself to be.